The first thing War Master Seketh noticed was the cup. It sat on the edge of the interrogation table, ceramic, chipped at the rim, filled with something dark and steaming, and the human had not touched it in 4 hours. Not once. He simply let it sit there, cooling, and stared at the wall with eyes that tracked nothing Seketh's instruments could measure. The cup was not a concern. The cup was a detail. Except that every species the hegemony had ever captured, every rational, pain-averse, biologically self-preserving species, reached for comfort when comfort was available. They drank. They ate. They performed small acts of normalcy to maintain psychological coherence under stress. It was a universal constant. The xenopsychologists had 17 papers on it. The human had not touched the cup. Seketh filed that detail somewhere cold and quiet inside his mind, and proceeded with the interrogation as planned. He would return to the cup later. By then, it would be too late to understand what it meant. The hegemony's official record of the engagement at Karath's Folly, a name humans had given the system, which should have been the first warning, listed the capture of General Mara Voss as a decisive strategic victory. 43 words. Clean. Conclusive. What the record did not mention was that General Voss had allowed herself to be captured. What the record could not mention was that, in the 6 hours between her capture and the moment War Master Seketh first sat across from her, every human fleet in the surrounding 4 sectors had abruptly, simultaneously, inexplicably changed course. Not retreated, not advanced. Changed course, to destinations no hegemony predictive model could calculate. This was Mystery 1, and Seketh carried it into the interrogation room like a stone behind his sternum. Mystery 2 was older. It had been accumulating for 11 months since the war began. Humans, by every biological metric, should have broken. Their pain thresholds were unremarkable. Their lifespans were short. Their population density relative to controlled territory was thin. The hegemony's strategic models that had correctly predicted the collapse of 4 civilizations, had given humanity between 8 and 14 months of organized military resistance before psychological fragmentation. 11 months later, humanity was not fragmented. Humanity was, somehow, more organized than when the war started. Seketh did not understand this. The xenopsychologists did not understand this. The High Computation Council had revised their models 3 times, and each revision quietly removed the confidence intervals from the collapse projection because the confidence intervals had become embarrassing. General Voss, Seketh said, settling into the chair across from her. His translator rendered his words in the flat, serviceable human language his team had been using. "We can begin whenever you are ready." The human looked at him. She had brown eyes, a color Seketh associated with soil on a specific agricultural world the hegemony had processed 4 decades ago, and something in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite contempt, but lived in the territory between. "I've been ready," she said. "You kept me waiting." "A deliberate choice," Seketh said. "We wanted you to be uncomfortable." "I know," she looked at the cup. "You can take that, I don't want it." Seketh made a notation. Mystery 3 arrived 7 minutes into the interrogation, disguised as a non-answer, which was the most dangerous shape a mystery could take. He had asked about the fleet movements, a reasonable opening, broad, non-threatening, designed to establish baseline response patterns before escalating. The question gave her room to deflect safely, which meant her deflection would be informative. Every species deflected from their true concerns. The direction of deflection was always the point. Mara Voss did not deflect. She smiled fully this time and said, "Which ones?" 2 words. Seketh's translator confirmed them twice. "Which ones?" Not "I won't answer that." Not "I don't know what you mean." Not the careful sidestep of a prisoner protecting intelligence. "Which ones?" As though there were so many fleet movements, currently underway, that she needed clarification. Seketh kept his expression still. Outside this room, in the hegemony's sensor web spanning 6 sectors, his analysts were already working with the data they had. 47 human fleet elements, last confirmed positions 12 hours ago, current positions unknown, projected positions computationally inconclusive. 47 fleets. Which ones? He changed the subject, filed the answer, felt the stone behind his sternum grow heavier. The hegemony had not wanted this war. That distinction mattered to Seketh, who was a methodical creature and found comfort in accurate records, even inconvenient ones. The expansion into the Karath corridor had been economic. The human settlements there had been small, recently established, legally ambiguous under 7 different frameworks of interstellar territorial claim. The hegemony's legal team had produced a document. The relevant human governing body had produced a counter-document. The hegemony's legal team had produced a document responding to the counter-document. Then a hegemony patrol cruiser had fired on a human transport near a station called Meridian Point, and the documents became irrelevant. What followed should have been a suppression action. That was the word in the official record, suppression. It implied a relationship between force applied and resistance overcome. It implied a curve that bent predictably toward resolution. The humans had not read the curve. In the first 6 weeks, they lost 11 systems, 43 stations, and an estimated 2 million civilians to displacement. Seketh had reviewed those numbers. They were devastating. By any historical model, a civilization absorbing those losses in that time frame was entering terminal psychological collapse. The moment when the civilian population began demanding their leadership accept any terms, when the military began fracturing under questions of why they were still fighting, when the whole weight of suffering became heavier than the abstract concept of resistance. Instead, human enlistment had increased by 312% in the 6 weeks after Meridian Point. The hegemony's analysts had checked the data 4 times. They had even sent a query to the computational archives asking whether a data corruption was possible. The archives had confirmed the data was clean. An analyst named Voreth had written a 3-page memo arguing the number must be wrong because it was mathematically inconsistent with rational behavioral models. He had submitted the memo. He had been thanked for his diligence. The memo had been quietly archived. The number was not wrong. "You've lost 46 ships since I've been in this room," Mara Voss said. Seketh had been reviewing a document. He looked up. "I beg your pardon." 46, she said again, with the patient tone of someone who has already calculated that the other party will ask her to repeat herself. "Give or take. Depends on how the 3rd Meridian Group handled the Keth 7 junction. If Commandant Akafer went aggressive, maybe more. He usually does." Silence. Seketh's second-in-command, Sub-War Master Ithrin, was standing near the door. Seketh heard her make a small sound, not a word, just the involuntary articulation of disbelief escaping through an almost closed throat. "You are bluffing," Seketh said. "I'm not, though. No heat in it. No performance." She said it the way a technician confirms a reading. "You can check with your fleet command in about." She glanced at the wall with the nothing in it, as though she could see through to something, 4 minutes. That's roughly when the communication lag from the Keth 7 junction reaches this station. Seketh did not check. He continued the interrogation. He asked about supply lines, about command structure, about the Human Governing Council's current position. She answered some questions with the careful half-answers of a professional, and other questions with a silence that was somehow louder than the answers. Exactly 4 minutes later, his communications panel activated. He did not let himself look at it immediately. He finished his sentence. He noted her response. Then he glanced at the panel. 41 ships, not 46, but the 3rd Meridian Group, a designation the hegemony had assigned based on intercepts, not human-nomming conventions, had confirmed aggressive action at Keth 7. 41 ships, and she had said give or take. Ithrin left the room without being dismissed. Seketh heard her footsteps stop just outside the door in the hall, where she would begin making urgent calls in a low, controlled voice that was the hegemony equivalent of screaming. Seketh looked at Mara Voss. She was looking at the empty cup. Her expression was the most unsettling thing he had encountered in 40 years of military service, because it was not triumph, was not relief, was not the performance of confidence a bluffing prisoner deploys. She looked tired. She looked like someone watching a plan proceed exactly as intended, and finding the precision more exhausting than comforting. "Why did you tell me that?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Because you needed to understand something," she said, "before we have the real conversation." Seketh authorized a security review. Full spectrum. The station's sensor logs, communication archives, every data packet that had entered or exited since Voss's capture, every system her transit pod had interfaced with, every atmospheric reading in her holding cell, every anomalous power fluctuation in the station's grid. The security team spent 9 hours on it. They found nothing. This was worse than finding something. If she had transmitted, if she had used hidden technology, if there was a mechanism could be understood, countered, sealed. A mechanism implied human capability operating at a level the hegemony recognized as intelligence. It was understandable as a higher tier of the same category of behavior. Nothing implied something else entirely. Sub-War Master Ithrin put it in her operational log at hour 11 of the review. Either General Voss has a transmission capability we cannot detect, or she knew what her fleets would do before we captured her, which means the fleet movements are not a response to her capture. They preceded the capture as intent. She knew this moment was coming. She may have built it. Seketh read that entry twice. Then he went back into the interrogation room. She was standing this time, doing something he had no word for, moving through a slow sequence of physical positions, arms and legs in deliberate configurations, weight shifting from one foot to the other in patterns that repeated but were not identical. When he entered, she stopped, unhurried, and turned to face him. "What is that?" he asked. "Something we do when we've been still too long," she said. "Keeps the body functional." "You were not uncomfortable." "No," she sat back down. "But the body doesn't care about comfort, it cares about maintenance." He absorbed this, filed it next to the cup she hadn't touched because comfort was not the priority. The body maintenance that was not about feeling better, but about remaining operational. He was beginning to suspect that everything he had categorized as a human behavior was actually a human asterisk maintenance protocol, and that he did not understand what they were maintaining themselves for. "The real conversation," he said. "You said that yesterday." "I did. I'm listening." She looked at him for a moment, not the calculating look of a negotiator measuring an opponent, but something quieter, evaluating maybe, or deciding how much of the truth to make him carry. "War Master," she said, "why do you think I'm here?" "We captured you during the engagement at—" "No," her voice didn't rise, it simplified, cut to the bone of the word. "Why do you think asterisk I am here?" The silence stretched. Seketh felt something shift inside the architecture of his assumptions. Ithrin's note in the operational log surfaced in his mind. She may have built it. "You wanted to be captured," he said slowly. "I needed to be here," she said. "There's a difference." And here is where Seketh's understanding of the last 11 months broke open and revealed something underneath that he had not known was there. A structure of human intent that had been operating beneath the surface of every engagement, every retreat, every inexplicable choice, every data point the analysts had struggled to reconcile. He thought he had been interrogating a prisoner. He had been in a meeting. "The fleet movements," he said, They are not responding to your capture. No, they preceded it. By about 3 weeks, she confirmed. The adjustment started when we confirmed you had taken the bait at Keth 7. The positioning has been in motion since then. The bait at Keth 7. The engagement where the hegemony's third forward fleet had overextended pursuing a human carrier group that had, apparently, wanted to be pursued. The engagement that Hegemony Command had logged as a decisive territorial victory, control of a strategically significant junction point. The junction point that 47 human fleet elements were currently surrounding from vectors that hegemony predictive models had not anticipated, because the models assumed human forces would protect their own supply lines. The humans had not protected their supply lines. The humans had moved between the hegemony fleets and the hegemony's asterisk supply lines. You didn't come here to be interrogated, Seketh said. The words felt strange in his mouth, too large, like vocabulary that had been the right size yesterday and had grown overnight. You came here to be asterisk present, to be in this room. I came here, she said, because this is where the conversation had to happen, because you needed to look at me, at a human, and understand something before your command makes a decision that you won't be able to walk back. And what is it I need to understand? The look she gave him then was the thing he would describe in reports for the next 4 years and never quite get right. Not because the emotion was alien. It was deeply, recognizably human. It was because he recognized it as the expression of someone who had already paid a price he couldn't calculate, in a currency he was only beginning to understand existed. We don't fight until we win, she said. We fight until you stop. Those are not the same thing. He requested access to the classified engagement archives that night. Not the official hegemony records, the operational ones. Raw data, unprocessed reports from unit commanders in the field, before the information had been shaped into the clean, definitive language of official documentation. The language that made asterisk 43 ships destroyed into a data point rather than a sequence of events with causes and choices embedded inside them. What he found in those files remade the war in his mind, one small detail at a time. At Varnath Station, 6 months ago, the hegemony's 7th occupation fleet had expected to process a civilian surrender. The station's military complement had been overwhelmed 3 days prior. By all models, the civilian population should have been broadcasting surrender protocols within 48 hours. They had broadcast something else. The station's chief administrator, a civilian, a bureaucrat responsible for water recycling and agricultural scheduling and residential permits, had organized the station's remaining population of 11,000 into a defensive configuration using maintenance corridors and service tunnels. They had held the station for 31 days. The 7th Occupation Fleet's commander had filed a report noting, with evident frustration, the civilian population demonstrated tactical cohesion inconsistent with their roles and training. We observed no central command structure we could locate or neutralize. When we removed apparent leaders, new ones emerged without a parent selection process. We do not understand the organizing principle. Seketh read that report twice. Then he read the report from Kethara Minor, where a human unit of approximately 300 soldiers had held a processing facility against 4,000 hegemony troops for 19 days. The facility had no strategic value. It was a water processing plant for a population of 60,000 that the hegemony had already evacuated. There was nothing there to protect. The unit had held it anyway, had died holding it, largely. 87 survivors had been captured, all of them injured, none of them willing to explain in any terms the hegemony's interrogators could make sense of why they had stayed. One had said, because you needed to keep troops there. The interrogator had marked that as delusional, a rationalization from a defeated and traumatized prisoner. Seketh sat with it for a long moment. 300 soldiers holding a worthless facility for 19 days, forcing the hegemony to commit 4,000 troops to the engagement. 300 soldiers turning themselves into a calculation, spending themselves like a currency, buying 19 days in which 4,000 hegemony troops were not available for any other operation. We fight until you stop. He sent for Ithran at 300 station time. How many of these are in the archives? He asked her, gesturing at the files on his display. She looked at the display for a long moment. I started pulling the full operational record 6 hours ago, she said, when I noticed the pattern you're seeing. A pause. There are hundreds of them, Warmaster. Hundreds of engagements where our after-action reports marked the outcome as inconclusive or as a hegemony victory, and the underlying data shows. Shows what? Ithran met his eyes. She was not a creature given to dramatic expression. 40 years in the hegemony's military intelligence apparatus had refined her into a precision instrument. He had once seen her receive news of a personal loss and continue a briefing without interruption. Shows that every time we won, they made us pay for it, she said. Not by fighting harder, by choosing where and how they lost, by losing in ways that cost us more than winning should cost. The stone behind his sternum had become something larger. How long, he asked. Since the beginning. She pulled up a timeline, laid it next to the operational archives. The pattern was there immediately, and Seketh felt the strange physical sensation of a mind being forced to expand to accommodate a new shape of information. The first 6 weeks, Warmaster, the 11 systems we took, the 2 million displaced, we thought they were reeling. They were clearing their civilians from sectors they had already decided to trade. He looked at the timeline. They gave us those systems. They gave us those systems at a cost we don't have a full accounting of yet. The communication panel activated. A priority message from Hegemony High Command. The High Council, having received updated intelligence on the fleet movements, was convening an emergency session. Warmaster Seketh was ordered to present his intelligence findings, with particular emphasis on the capability and intent of the captured General Voss. He looked at the message for a long time. What are you going to tell them? Ithran asked. The truth, he said, assuming I can explain it in terms they'll believe. And if you can't? He didn't answer, because the answer was already obvious, and saying it aloud would not improve matters. He went back to the interrogation room instead. Mara Voss was asleep on the floor when he entered. Not on the cot, the floor, her back against the wall, knees loosely bent, in a posture that looked uncomfortable by any standard he could apply. She woke when the door opened, not gradually, immediately. Eyes open and alert, the transition from sleep to full awareness so instantaneous it looked, to Seketh's eyes, slightly wrong, like a machine engaging rather than a consciousness surfacing. How do you do that? He asked before he meant to. Do what? Wake like that all at once. She thought about it, a genuine consideration, not a deflection. We learned it, she said simply, or we are it, I'm not sure which came first. He sat down. The cup was gone, removed by the staff finally. The table between them was empty now and felt more honest for it. The High Council wants my report on you, he said. They want to know what you represent as an intelligence asset. And what are you going to tell them? I'm going to tell them, he said carefully, that you are not an intelligence asset, that capturing you was not a strategic gain, that the 41 ships lost yesterday at Keth 7 are the beginning of an accounting, not the end of one. He paused. And then they are going to ask me what they should do. What will you say? He looked at her across the empty table. I don't know yet. I was hoping you would tell me what you came here to tell me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, your High Council has 60 hours. Before what? Before the positions become permanent, she said. Before my people are committed far enough forward that the engagement can't be stopped from the outside. It can still be stopped from inside if your command makes a decision in the next 60 hours. After that, she stopped. After that, the only thing that stops it is when one side runs out of reasons to continue. And your side, Seketh said slowly, does not run out of reasons. You haven't yet, she said, and you should think carefully about what that means because it's not bravado and it's not propaganda. We lost 119,000 people in 11 months. We have recruiters turning away volunteers because we can't equip them fast enough. A pause. Her voice didn't change pitch, but something shifted under it, something that he recognized after a beat, as grief operating at a depth that didn't surface in tone. That's not a species that runs out of reasons. Seketh sat with that. What do you want? He asked. The Karath corridor, she said. Human jurisdiction, permanent status, no hegemony military presence. Full economic access for both parties under a treaty framework that we negotiate as equals. She let that land. That's it. That was always it. It was in the counterdocument your legal team responded to 14 months ago. He remembered the document. He remembered thinking it was an opening negotiating position, something to be reduced through the natural pressure of strategic imbalance. He thought about the water processing plant, the 300 soldiers, the 19 days. You knew we wouldn't agree to the original terms, he said. We thought you might, given time. The grief moved closer to the surface, just a fraction. We were wrong about that. We're not wrong about this. You're describing a situation where you hold a strategic position that, if we attempt to break it, will cost us more than the Karath corridor is worth economically. Yes. And if we accept the terms, then your 67 fleet elements that are currently positioned between your core systems and your frontier supply chain go back to wherever they were, and we stop putting soldiers in buildings to make your victories expensive. The simplicity of it was almost violent. 14 months of war, 119,000 human dead, 41 hegemony ships in the last day alone, and the mechanism that ended it was the same document that had existed before the first shot was fired. Unchanged. As though the war itself had been, from the human side, an extended and catastrophically costly act of making a point. Your people would call that a victory, Seketh said. My people, she said quietly, would call it over, which is better. He thought about the enlistment numbers. 312%. He thought about the residents of Varnath Station, organizing in the service tunnels. He thought about the water processing plant and the 87 survivors who had said because you needed to keep troops there, which had been filed as delusional, and was actually a strategic briefing delivered by a soldier too injured to care about its proper format. He thought about the cup she hadn't touched in 4 hours, not because she was too distressed to want comfort, because she had already decided before entering this room that comfort was not what this time was for. He stood. I'll need the 60 hours, he said. I know, she looked at the empty table, I'll be here. He made the presentation to the High Council at 800. He had been awake for 31 hours. He was aware of this as a data point, not as a complaint. The council had 17 members. They received his report in the manner of people who had already decided how they felt about the information they were about to receive, and were primarily interested in the presentation confirming their existing position. He knew this. He had served the hegemony long enough to know the particular quality of attention that preceded a predetermined conclusion. He presented the data anyway. He showed them the Varnath Station records, the water processing plant, the timeline Ithrin had constructed, showing the 6 weeks of early advances as a map of human sacrifice. Systems offered up, civilians cleared in advance, territory traded for hegemony commitment that then became hegemony overextension. He showed them the current fleet positions, the supply chain analysis, the engagement projections. Councillor Meth, the most senior member, said, "This is the projection of a single analyst operating under time pressure and possible manipulation by the prisoner. The fleet positions are confirmed by independent sensor networks," Seketh said. "They are not a projection." The asterisk interpretation of the fleet positions, Meth said, with the patience of someone who had been deciding things for a very long time and had learned that patience carried authority, is a projection. Counselor, Seketh said. He heard something in his own voice that was unfamiliar, not insubordination, but a complete absence of the deference that usually surrounded his disagreements. The deference had been operating on an assumption that the council's strategic judgment, while sometimes wrong, was always operating from a coherent understanding of the situation. He no longer held that assumption. The human general told me the number of ships we had lost to within 5 before the report reached this station. She described the specific actions of a unit commander she had not communicated with. She has been in a sealed room with no communications access for 38 hours, and she is more current on our operational situation than your intelligence bureau. Silence. She does not have hidden technology, he continued. She has a plan that was built far enough in advance that she does not need current information. She already knows what her people are doing because she designed what her people are doing, and she came here voluntarily, deliberately, to offer us the option of stopping it before it concludes. He held the silence for a moment. She is not a prisoner, counselor. She is a messenger who chose the most secure delivery method available, being inside our most protected facility, where we have to listen to her. Counselor Vetharan, who was younger than the others and had been quiet through the entire presentation, said, "If we accept her terms." "Then the war ends," Seketh said. "The Karath corridor becomes human jurisdiction. We retain all other territorial gains. We negotiate economic access. We lose nothing we had before the engagement at Meridian Point. We lose the appearance of having been compelled," Meth said. The room was quiet. "Yes," Seketh said, "we do." The deliberation took 41 hours. During that time, Seketh returned to the interrogation room 11 times. Not because there was new information to extract he was now certain, extracted everything she intended him to extract, and the efficiency of that process still disturbed him in ways he hadn't fully mapped. He returned because something about that room anchored his thinking. Or possibly because something about her asterisk presence anchored it. The quality of stillness she maintained, which was not passivity, was not resignation, was the stillness of something that had committed completely to waiting and had no conflict about the waiting, because the waiting was also the plan. On the 9th visit, he asked her something he had been holding for a long time. "The 119,000, he said. "Did they know? The ones at the water processing plant, the ones at Varnath, did they know what they were part of?" She didn't answer immediately. He watched her not answer, watched her decide how to carry this particular truth. "Some of them," she said finally. "The ones who had been fighting long enough to see the shape of it." A pause. "Not all of them needed to know. They needed to be willing." "And they were." "They were." "That's," he stopped, started again. "I don't have a word for that in my language. A species in which individuals die for a geometric position in a long-term plan they may not fully understand, because they trust the plan, because they trust each other enough to." He stopped again. The concept was fracturing against his vocabulary. "Loyalty," she said. "We call it loyalty, but I think it might be something bigger than the word." She looked at her hands. "It scares us too sometimes, what we're capable of asking each other to do." "You asked them to die." "I asked them to fight," she said. "They decided the rest." The grief was fully at the surface now. She didn't suppress it and she didn't surrender to it. It simply existed in her voice alongside everything else, the strategy, the certainty, the exhaustion, like a chord containing a dissonant note that made the harmony more complete by refusing to be excluded. Every one of them decided. He had 40 years of military service. He had ordered actions that cost lives. He had made calculations. He had never, in 40 years, felt the specific weight that was now in the room. The weight of understanding that a general who sent soldiers to die in a water processing plant for 19 days had then sat in an interrogation room for 38 hours not touching a cup of something warm, because she was still on duty, because she was still in the part of the plan that needed her to be present and operational, because she would grieve when the mission was complete and not before. On the 11th visit, he told her the council was close to a decision. "I know," she said. "You know because if they were going to reject the terms," she said, "there would have been military action by now. 41 hours of deliberation is a council that's deciding how to frame an acceptance, not whether to accept." He had no answer for that. The council voted at hour 41, 12-5. The acceptance terms were different in language from the original document, new phrasing, new treaty structure, the appearance of a negotiated outcome rather than a capitulated one. But the substance was the same. The Karath Corridor, human jurisdiction, permanent status, joint economic framework, no hegemony military presence. Seketh delivered the decision to Mara Voss personally. She listened to the full terms. She asked 3 specific questions about implementation timelines. She received his answers with the careful attention of someone who would need to replicate this conversation accurately to other people who needed to make decisions based on it. Then she said, "I'll need to contact my command." "Of course," he paused. "How long before your fleets stand down?" "They're not standing down," she said, and he felt a cold shock of alarm before she continued. "They're repositioning. It takes time. You'll see the movements within 6 hours. They'll be complete in approximately 32. She met his eyes. "I told you 60 hours. We have 19 left." "Efficient," he said. "It came out flat. He meant it as something else." She looked at him. "War Master, is there something else?" He thought about saying *no. He thought about the professional conclusion, the handshake or equivalent, the transition to the logistical work of ending a war. He thought about 41 hours of deliberation and 12-5, and the council's careful language about negotiated outcomes. "My commanders," he said, "the ones who reviewed the operational archives, Ithrin, several others, they will not look at humanity the same way after this. I'm telling you that not as a threat, as a fact. What you are willing to do, what your people are willing to do to each other for a position." He paused. "There will be those in the hegemony who are afraid of you now, specifically because you accepted losses of that scale without breaking. Who will argue that a species which does not break under that kind of pressure is dangerous," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "We know," she said softly. "We've always known that's not something we can fix." A pause. "We're not going to make ourselves easier to understand just because being understood wrong is a threat. We're just—" She stopped, started differently. "You asked me why we fight. I gave you the strategic answer. The real answer is simpler and probably makes us harder to understand, not easier." She looked past him at nothing in particular. "We just don't know when to stop. It's not a virtue. It's not a choice. It's just what we are. We find something worth holding and we hold it until we can't anymore, and most of the time we don't reach *can't. He thought about the water processing plant, the service tunnels of Varnath Station, the 312%. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what I mean." He watched the fleet repositioning begin 6 hours later, exactly as she had said. 47 elements, then more forces he hadn't known were positioned, emerging from vectors his analysts scrambled to map, moving through the mathematics of disengagement in patterns that somehow managed to be orderly and incomprehensible at the same time. Ithrin stood beside him at the sensor display, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "How many did we not know about?" she finally asked. "We're still counting," said the analyst at the board. 67 fleet elements, 73. The hegemony's sensor web, which had been tracking humanity's military capacity for 11 months and had consistently revised its estimates downward, because the numbers didn't fit the resource projections, ticked upward and upward and upward. "War Master," the analyst said, with the careful voice of someone delivering information they do not fully believe. "The repositioning is complete." "How many?" 81 confirmed elements, possibly more that have moved outside sensor range before we could catalog them. Ithrin was quiet for a moment. "Then we thought they were stretched thin." "They were," Seketh said. He heard the word in his own voice and knew it was accurate. They had been stretched thin. They had been stretched in the way a material stretches under load, not weakening, but extending, covering more territory than its dimensions suggested possible, because stretching was something it could do. They were stretched thin and they held. That is what stretched thin means for them. Mara Voss was on a transport back to human space by then. He had watched her board without ceremony, without the performance of triumph that he had half expected and would have half understood. She had shaken his hand, a human gesture he had been briefed on but found slightly strange in practice, and said something he had not expected. "I'm sorry about your ships," she said. "The 41 at Keth 7. I'm sorry we got to a place where that was the cost." "It was not your ships," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you didn't want this war either, and I know that, and it doesn't change what happened." He had not had a response ready for that. He had managed something that, in retrospect, was not very adequate. She had boarded the transport, and the bay doors had closed, and he had stood in the dock for a while longer than was probably necessary. He wrote his formal report over 2 days. Ithrin helped, though her contribution was mostly questions, the precision instrument's habit of identifying every claim that required a stronger foundation. The report ran to 112 pages. The executive summary, which was all most of the High Council would read, ran to 4. He knew, writing it, that it would not fully convey what he understood now. Language had limits. The gaps between species were not just in vocabulary, but in the architecture of what words were built on, the assumptions about what motivated living things, about how suffering moved through a species, about what a civilization was willing to pay, and what it considered payment. He wrote it anyway. He included the water processing plant. He included Varnath Station. He included the cup she hadn't touched, because he had become certain, in the weeks since, that the cup was the most important data point in the entire file. The single clearest expression of what made humanity different from every species the hegemony had ever encountered. They had offered her comfort. She had looked at it and decided, quietly and completely, that comfort was not what this time was for. Not because she didn't want it, not because she was beyond needing it. Because the mission was still running. Counselor Meth read the report in full, which surprised Seketh when he found out. Meth sent him a message afterward, 3 lines. "Your account of the human general is troubling in ways I don't have adequate language for. I'd like to understand what you believe we should now consider them to be. Not an enemy, not an ally. What?" Seketh looked at that message for a long time. He wrote back, "A mirror. But the reflection is in a medium we don't yet know how to read. I recommend we learn." He sent it, closed the display, stood at his office window looking at the slow transit of traffic through the station's outer ring, civilian ships, supply transports, the ordinary movement of a civilization at peace in this particular sector, for now. Somewhere in human space, 119,000 graves were new enough that the inscriptions hadn't fully weathered yet. In the Karath corridor, resettlement was beginning, people moving back to stations they had evacuated months ago, carrying whatever they had taken with them. In a treaty framework document that was currently being finalized by legal teams on both sides, the word =* appeared for the first time in any hegemony document referring to another species. Mara Voss had made one more statement before boarding the transport. He had almost missed it, she'd said it quietly, not directed at him, almost to herself, while she was already moving toward the ramp. He had asked on impulse what she'd said. She had paused, looked back at him. "I said that's one." He hadn't asked what she meant. He had been in that moment not quite ready for the answer. He was still not sure he was ready. But standing at the window, watching the civilian traffic, he found the question arranging itself with a slow and terrible clarity, not as alarm, but as a recognition of something true settling permanently into the structure of how he understood the universe. One war ended, one corridor secured, one treaty signed. One hegemony, with its 6 centuries of expansion and 40 documented civilizations, either absorbed or negotiated into irrelevance, having just spent 11 months learning that there was a species in the galaxy that measured things differently, that had looked at the same tactical situation from which every other civilization had eventually extrapolated the wisdom of surrender, and had extracted instead a lesson about geometry and patience and the specific productive use of loss. That's one. As though she were counting, as though this was a thing that had a number attached to it, and the number was not yet interesting, and whatever came next was already, somewhere, already in motion. Seketh was a creature of method and record, 40 years of military precision, a mind built for analysis. He was not given to the kind of thinking that reached past available evidence. He reached past it anyway. He thought about a species that didn't know how to stop, that found something worth holding and held it, that could look at 119,000 dead and respond not with grief that collapsed inward but with grief that somehow propelled forward, that could put a general in a capture situation voluntarily and have her sit for 38 hours without touching a cup of something warm, because the plan was still running, because she was still in it. He thought about 81 fleet elements, maybe more. He thought about that's one. The hegemony had encountered humanity 11 months ago at a transit station called Meridian Point over a legal document about a corridor of space neither side desperately needed. Had fired first on a miscalculation, the same miscalculation every powerful thing makes about smaller things, the one that confuses size with significance. They had not been the first to make it. They would not, Seketh understood now with the specific precision of a professional looking at a long pattern and identifying its next point, be the last. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy. It was not the most advanced, the most numerous, the longest lived, the most technologically sophisticated, the most strategically elegant. It did not have the largest ships or the deepest history or the most efficient biology. It had something else, something that Seketh had been circling for weeks, something that the hegemony's xenopsychologists had built 17 papers around without quite touching, something that lived in the gap between a cup of something warm and a decision not to pick it up. The willingness to be in a situation that was genuinely terrible, to look at everything the situation was costing, to feel all of it, the grief, the exhaustion, the weight of decisions that could not be undone, and to continue anyway. Not because they didn't understand the cost, because they had already decided the cost was acceptable before they ever walked into the room. They were not unbreakable. They were something worse than unbreakable. They were beings who had looked at the possibility of breaking, had looked at it clearly and without flinching, and had decided that even broken, they would find a way to be useful to the thing they were holding. The station traffic moved through the outer ring, quiet and ordinary in the long peace of a Tuesday. Somewhere, 81 fleet elements were repositioning to wherever they went when wars ended, and Mara Voss was on a transport, heading home, and she had said that's the way a person says asterisk first who has already thought about second and third, and is simply being honest about the sequence. Seketh stood at his window for a long time. He did not find the thought comforting. He did not find it threatening. He found it the way one finds a law of physics true in a way that precedes any opinion about it, settled into the structure of how things were, immovable and enormous, and now, permanently, impossible to unknow. The galaxy was very old. It had seen many great things come and go. It had witnessed the rise and collapse of 600 civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the slow migration of species across the dark between systems.